the reprogramming centers. This is the real history and timeline of our recent past 150 years. In all my previous videos, the ones labeled Tartarian Cataclysm, I have been piecing together a very serious truth that I've been providing proofs on within each video. Today, we're going to start at what happened right after the reset that took place. Natural, and I'm talking about the reset that burned all the buildings down, leaving mountains of burned structure buildings instead of real natural nature. It is my guess that the reset happened around the 1920s or a little before. And I saw this because there were still Tartarians around until that date, as well as their culture. It was after that date that I started to see fabricated history, or fabricated versions of history. So I simply traced back to where I could see something real or genuine, without any misinformative, deceptive narratives. You know, the words misinformation or misinformative might seem like very light things to say, but you must understand that when you have individuals that have the hatred of the human race to the point that they want to have full control of humans, and to actually destroy as much of humanity as they can, and only have a small manageable amount of humans left on the planet that they can control. The fact that this has already been happening for a long time is why I want to just reiterate this right now, that this is actually something I hope people, when they see this video, take this as something incredibly serious. And I'm not saying to get in any fear space, and I'm not saying to spike your vibrations at all. Just understand, if you believe and resonate with the things I've been saying, you know, at least myself, the second my eyes opened to all this, I have not really stopped looking for the truth. I would take breaks because I needed to have balance, but that's a problem, and it's absolutely a problem that these blatant examples of this misinformation and false narratives, and just as let's call it what it is straight up, lies and conscious intentional deception on a mass level to keep humanity from the truth. So my sense of urgency that I'm expressing here is because this is something that should be actually being talked about amongst peers, and absolutely brought forward to higher levels of law enforcement. This needs to be something seriously looked at, and not just something that a few people on YouTube have come to discover. So I just wanted to make that statement. I'm going to get back to the timeline. After this event took place, this cataclysm that some people call the X Factor event, and I'm thinking it happened sometime in the 1800s. It's also to my knowledge that the Tartarians starting in the 1400s or 1500 seconds had 3 levels of genocide or malicious culling or killing of their race over a 350-year period. I believe before Russia and the specific group of Russia that was attacking them really got serious and began taking them out directly, there were efforts to decrease their population or numbers. There was a food famine that I heard actually a lot of people died from during that time. And there were some illnesses, diseases, and sicknesses that also took out a large portion of that population. And the final thing was this direct energy attack on the millions of Tartarians, or the ones that were left. There's a lot that's being said about what exactly happened, but we all know based on the fire trail and burnt trails that we see on the buildings that it was an event of extreme heat, and it came from the ground and typically would then rise up through the buildings. So I do know they had some form of a directed energy weapon that they used, or they used the technology that was inside the star forts that the Tartarians would use for benevolent reasons to spread good vibrations around the community for healing purposes. I do believe that they got a hold of those star forts technology. Also, so not only did they turn the electric currents, or from the electricity that they were harvesting from the ether, back toward the populace, but because these brick buildings were not going to catch fire, well, what they would do is they would get it as hot as possible, and then just kind of spray it, or hit it once with a direct energy weapon. And that would create a massive fire, as well as a melting down of that house that they were focused on taking out. So it's kind of being said in what I researched, that you know the kind of last major big event was this kind of massive fire. But this wasn't just any regular old fire. This was a controlled fire as well as direct energy weapon attack on the final populations of the Tartarians. And there's some literature out there that has people, I think, who wrote about the experience and what the fires were like. They mentioned that it was almost like it was raining fire, like there was plasma coming down on everybody everywhere. That direct energy weapon mixed with the other high-voltage electrical heat and turned into this being like a plasma attack. So as people were trying to help themselves, save themselves, everything was coming down, being burnt to a crisp. Bricks coming down to just rubble. And as people were running away, here comes the plasma rain of fire. Or it could be comparable to lava, just to make sure that no one gets away. And that's how the final reset cataclysmic culling and genocide of the Tartarians took place. So what happens now? It says that it just takes one generation to forget everything that they either knew or grew up with, or were taught by their parents in regards to anything. So this was right around the time of all the orphan trains, and I believe this was the early 1900s, and these were a think with the children. I'm actually very sure coming from Tartaria over there in Eurasia. I think something like 6 million orphans were transferred from Eurasia or Tartaria to the United States. At this time, early 1900s, the United States had about 78% less people than it did right now. So after the big killing event, let's call the parasites the dark ones or the deep state. The deep states were trying to populate the Americas while they had this quick opportunity after this massive genocide, and also to populate the country under the false narrative, rewritten false history, and complete controlled agenda, and planned for any person that was going to be living there. They populated the United States with the millions of orphans that came by taken from their parents, or whatever the situation was. The parents were probably dead, and if anybody wanted to rat them out, or whistle blow on this cover-up, they would be thrown into the newly found and established insane asylums that just opened up for a short period of time. The reason are Capitol buildings, which are some of the most elegant, nicest looking buildings I've ever seen. And obviously, these are buildings we cannot build ourselves today. They came from the Tartarians and the previous civilization that's not talked about. Because they couldn't destroy all of the beautiful architecture that was laden across the United States, even after the big cataclysmic X-Factor event. There were massive pockets of survival completely across the United States. And so any buildings of that civilization that were left over after this X-Factor event would go to the federal government, and they would be termed as federal buildings, Capitol buildings, government buildings, insane asylums, orphanages, and our universities. Because it would be very hard for them to convince a new humanity or a reset humanity about the low level of technology and small populated wild areas of the Americas when you're seeing architectural masterpieces all around you. So from the orphanages coming in and then silencing anybody that tries to go against what this new world order was trying to establish would be thrown into the insane asylums. They begin their worldwide, or more so United States agenda of reprogramming. It was at this point that they opened the reprogramming centers. It was at these reprogramming centers, which really were the first movie theaters out there. They literally were called reprogramming centers, that they would have masses of children, or anybody coming from other countries sit and watch whatever they wanted them to watch, so that they could reprogram them with their narrative, agenda, history, and belief. This is where the movie industry and television all came from. And it was meant to reprogram, or let's say program, people with false information, false narratives, and self-sabotaging belief systems in history. It was at these reprogramming centers that they would influence the people. Let's call them programming centers, because that's what they are. It was at these programming centers that they would influence people by showing them whatever they needed to show them to make them think that the world or the United States was the way that they wanted to present it. The way they wanted to present it was there was no free energy that people were easily getting worldwide from the atmosphere through a process of ether harvesting. At the time, they had a car that ran off of ether. So the automobile and locomotive industry never started with just gasoline, but after the mass genocide, they then went to the factories and killed millions of local humans that were creating automobiles that were already running off of free energy, and then implemented the oil and gas industry at this very specific moment of time. They then filled the factories up with newly programmed people. And I believe they even had orphans working at factories at the time, because it was a very low population. And they began creating vehicles that ran off of oil and gas because they knew that they could charge money for the oil and gas and thus control the population through the financial system that they also began to implement right at this time. And with all these orphanages popping up and consistently growing over many, many years, they also began the first educational system, which started out with a gentleman who was part of the deep state, or the New World Order. But immediately after this, the father of the new educational system are the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds are the ones that created the public school system. And instead of teaching our children important things and teaching them in an appropriate way, they had to go through 12 years of programming or reprogramming centers public school for the youth. And also under the guise or false guise of actually caring that laws would be passed that children would have to attend school. And thus, you see here how they funneled a new population through a gauntlet of programs with false information, thus creating the foundation of what I would say a majority, and a large majority of our population believes today. To be continued.